In my previous video, we debunked the videos by Astrobrant 2 and Phil Webb in which they objected to my proof that the mysterious halo photographed by SELENE, Clementine and Chandrayaan-1 were not the cause of the Apollo 15 engine plume. Today, we'll be looking at Astrobrant's video in which he responds to my video discussing the alleged boot print trails seen by LRO. Before we begin, let's familiarise ourselves with the term quote mining. Wikipedia defines the term as the practice of quoting out of context, sometimes referred to as contextomy or quote mining, is a logical fallacy and type of false attribution in which a passage is removed from its surrounding matter in such a way as to distort its intended meaning. Why do I bring this up? Let's watch Astrobrant's video and find out. Of all the images, the Apollo 12 photo and the two Apollo 14 photos have excited propaganda the most, because they supposedly show the trails left by the astronauts' boot prints.
Now, let's listen to some clips from your own video as you set up your arguments against the lunar foot tracks and see if there's anything interesting about them.
These cameras were mounted onto the inside of the Lunar Module's window and subsequently recorded the touchdown, the moonwalk, and the lunar liftoff. These cameras were mounted onto the inside of the Lunar Module's window and subsequently recorded the touchdown, the moonwalk, and the lunar liftoff. And subsequently recorded the touchdown, the moonwalk, and the lunar liftoff. Obviously, these cameras viewed the landing site from above. Obviously, these cameras viewed the landing site from above. Obviously, these cameras viewed the landing site from above. So we decided to compare the tread marks seen by the 16mm camera with those photographed by LRO.
Would you be referring to this camera, which filmed this landing, this moonwalk, this takeoff, and these lunar tracks, none of which would exist if you were correct about the Apollo missions being fake? Incredibly, you have gotten so carried away with trying to debunk the LRO photos that you didn't even realize that in all of these examples you have just admitted that we went to the moon.
What did I say earlier about quote mining? The majority of this video is nothing more than playing with these out-of-context clips from my narration over and over again, as though it is somehow proof that I believe the missions were real. One would have thought my stance was clear when I said the LRO images supposedly show the trails left by the astronauts. They supposedly show the trails left by the astronauts' boot prints. One would think that once is enough to establish one's belief. Apparently not. So here are all those quotes that Astrobrant shows in context. Supposedly, these cameras were mounted onto the inside of the so-called Lunar Module's window and subsequently recorded the alleged touchdown, the alleged moonwalk, and the alleged lunar liftoff. Obviously, these cameras allegedly viewed the supposed landing site from above. But it did supposedly manage to see the alleged trails left by the so-called astronauts. And so on and so on and so on. Talk about a weak argument. It would be incredibly tedious to narrate like that. For that reason, I usually leave out the excess wording when quoting the official story, because everyone knows I don't believe it.
Despite your attempt to push your agenda by drawing these little pictures over top of the image, I still see it as it actually is. Yes, there are some slight differences, but let's make a couple of points about this while we're at it. First of all, your back-to-back comparison here proves that this film was taken from lunar liftoff, as we had no technology back then to resolve craters of this size other than going to the moon.
Oh no? Well, then how do you explain this image? This photo was taken by one of the Lunar Orbiter spacecrafts, which were launched between 1966 and 1967. It had a resolution of 1 meter per pixel, and resolved the landing sites prior to the Apollo missions. So all NASA would need to do is model their sets using the Lunar Orbiter photos as reference. We established that nearly a year ago, and even the most amateur of space historians all realize the significance of these missions. Astrobrant simply hasn't done his homework. It's hard to believe that Astrobrant could not have known this, because he briefly showed the clip in which I briefly compare the LRO Surveyor 3 photo with the Lunar Orbiter photo of Surveyor 1. So much for not having those resolving capabilities prior to Apollo. Propagandists love to point out any similarities between Apollo photographs and post-Apollo photographs and claim it strengthens their arguments. In reality, all it does is demonstrate their own ignorance of the fact that these areas were already mapped long before the Apollo missions. Now, being fair, certain individuals have written to say that the so-called artifacts and blueprint trails photographed by LRO are absent in the photos by Lunar Orbiter. True, but as we've seen already, the footprint trails shouldn't appear as they do in the LRO images. And you can't tell me that this is the best resolutions we can get when spy satellites and others, such as GeoEye-1, which has virtually the same resolution as LRO, have perfectly resolved cars and trucks from an altitude of 700 kilometers, as opposed to LRO's 70-kilometer altitude.
It should also be pointed out that these pictures were taken with the sun shining from opposite directions. And yes, there was a slight difference in camera position. Oh, about 50 miles.
All the change in position is going to do is make the objects appear slightly off-center. It won't change the shape of the formations. As far as the lighting conditions go, that's doubtful. True, we can't see the alleged descent stage in the 16mm feed, but the Hasselblad photography reveals the lunar module casting an elongated shadow towards the direction of the tracks. The LRO photo shows the so-called LEM casting an elongated shadow in the opposite direction seen in the Hasselblad photos. At best, all that will do is cast the shadows of the tiny mounds in the opposite direction, hardly enough to cause bootprint formations to change shape. The rest of Astrobrant's video is just pointless quoting out of context and ignorance of pre-Apollo photography. So he'll just move on to his next video, in which he addresses my claim that the darkness of the bootprint trails shown in the LRO images could only be caused by an unlikely number of densely packed bootprints. So what should bootprints look like from high up? At this altitude, it's not possible to see individual prints because they merge together. To find out then, I've created this simple pixel bootprint pattern. I'll enlarge it 10 times so that you can see it better.
You now proceed with your extremely complex and equally worthless demonstration of how bootprints should look from space using simulated images and manipulations which you have done on your computer. Here are the reasons why your analysis is so much bunk. First, the angle of the sun on the surface will have an effect on brightness and contrast. The angle of the camera to the surface will also. And the angle of the camera to the sun can also have a dramatic effect on how things look, especially on the moon. A whole landscape full of craters can appear smooth and featureless because of it. This alone completely debunks your footprint analysis.
No one doubts the sun's angle will affect the overall brightness. What I'm measuring here, though, is the relative brightness between the tracks and their surrounds. The question is whether the sun's angle alters the brightness by different degrees. To answer this, we will look at a newly released high-resolution image of the alleged Apollo 17 site. There are a few interesting aspects of this that I'll cover in a later video, but for now, I'll just measure the boot tracks. This picture was taken with the sun with 68 degrees above the horizon versus 40 degrees for the Apollo 12 image. Despite this 28 degree difference, the trails are around 30% darker in both cases. When we look at the Apollo 14 trails, however, it changes. Both the Apollo 12 and 14 landing sites were taken with the sun 40 degrees above the western horizon, yet the trails on the Apollo 14 photos are only 15% dark. If the sun's angle was the determining factor, we should see the same darkness.